Hello and welcome to July 2025, Fun in the Sun, for our first summer special. We're having fun with fiction, and I am thrilled to share with you my conversation with Annie Garthwaite. She talks about her wonderful book, Cecily, also her newer book, The King's Mother, taking us behind the scenes of the Wars of the Roses to see what the women are up to, especially the moms. I'm so excited, so sit back. Enjoy. Hope you're listening on the beach to our Fun with Fiction summer special on Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. Hello, and welcome to this special episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I am delighted to be speaking with someone I've wanted to speak to for such a long time, and I'm so happy she's here. Welcome to Annie Garthwaite. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Oh, that is such a nice welcome. Thank you so much. It's an absolute delight to be here speaking to you.
Well, I see you all over doing all kinds of things. So let me just introduce you to my listeners, or ask you rather to introduce yourself to my listeners. Tell us a little bit, just going way back, about what got you into history, what made you interested in becoming an author. What was that path like for you?
Well, it all started a very long time ago. My mum was an avid reader of historical fiction. And she sort of taught me to read long before I could go to school. And I think she just loved story and wanted to share story, this gift, with her daughter. So we sort of gave up on children's books fairly early, really. And I just started reading whatever she was reading. And that was mostly historical fiction. And it was, at the time, it was Catherine Cookson and Georgette Hare and Jean Clay,
Mm-hmm.
all the usual suspects. So that sort of idea that history and story were closely related was that came very naturally to me. That was sort of mother's milk to me.
Mm.
And then I guess the next big step was when I was in school. And I went to a really, really ordinary state school, not at all academic, quite the reverse. But I really lucked out in one respect. And I guess it can happen in any subject, but for me, it happened to be history, where I just had a brilliantly eccentric and enthusiastic history teacher. And he was teaching Wars of the Roses, and it was, I don't know how this would equate in the US, but I was doing O level, so I would have been about 14 or 15.
Okay.
And he was teaching Wars of the Roses, and I was just hooked because at a time when other teachers were just force feeding kids with dates and facts, he was telling stories. And he was talking about the people, and he just brought them to life. I expected Edward IV to step into the classroom at any minute because, he was just going to.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think poor old Keith Hill, my teacher, had really had a student interested in his subject before. I think most of his students were either bunking off or asleep. So this was quite a novel experience for him. So he got quite excited and he kept giving me things to read, and he'd sort of throw things over the desk at me. He said, read that, read this, read this. And mostly it was textbooks or biographies and that sort of thing. But occasionally a novel would come spinning across the desk. And one of the novels he gave me was a book called We Speak No Treason, which I don't know if you've come across it. It was written in the sort of 60s, 70s by a lady called Rosemary Harley Jarman. And it's about Richard III. And it's quite romantic, but I still think it's just beautifully written. She's such a great writer. And I was, 14, and I fell passionately in love with Richard III. So he was my big teenage crush, which was really worrying for my mum. She keeps saying, you do know he's dead, don't you? Yes, I do. It's the great tragedy of my life. So that's where it started, this interest in the Wars of the Roses. But then, I grew out of the crush pretty quickly, but I became much more interested in the women of the Wars of the Roses, more so than the men, because I guess as I just got older and became more aware of myself as a woman, I just found them so much more interesting. And that's where this whole thing and this whole, I guess it's an obsession with Cecily Neville and these women began right back then when I was in my teens. And so the idea for these novels that I've now written was really born in my head by the time I was in my early 20s. And my plan was then to, I went to university, and my plan was when I left university was to get a job in publishing and write at the same time. And I thought that would be lovely. You know, I'd be working with books all day and then I'd be writing weekends and evenings. And I thought that'd be just marvelous. But, you know, all the young women working in publishing then were called Polly or Fiona, and they were all engaged to Rupert. Well, they had a trust fund from Daddy, and it didn't matter that they earned threepence a month, you know. So I didn't have a Rupert or a trust fund, so I needed a plan B. So I knew I needed to, because there was just no time to write. I was working in bookshops at weekends and pubs at night just to pay rent in London. So I sort of did a deal with the devil that I would go into business proper and make a living. But that when I was 55, whatever the day job was by then, I would give it up and write this story about the women of the Wars of the Roses. And so I did.
That is such a wonderful story. And I appreciate you sharing, because it reminds us that there are all kinds of paths to get to this place you want. So, and as a woman, I think that's really empowering to hear. And I know you can't see it. I might look strangely underdressed because I only have a t-shirt on, but it's my Her Story t-shirt because I thought you would appreciate that. And it says, Her Story, history considered or presented with attention to the inclusion of women. So that is in my heart. And I know that you also have that in your heart. So I thought that would be a great thing to start with. So I appreciate that. Even though you started with your crush on Richard, I love the part of your story that it shifts to the women. So
I'm pretty quickly too. Yeah.
So I must ask that when you were young and then you started in the business world, you know, did those stories stay in your head and your heart all that time that you were on your diversion to make money before you could get back to them? Were they always around with you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, in so many, you know, people ask me how long did it take me to research these novels, and sometimes I just say, well, about 40 years. because because for all that time, you know, in between being 14 and being 55, I was reading about, thinking about these women and this period of history. So it's just been, you know, that teacher gave me a huge gift, you know, a real life-changing gift that's been a big part of my life for all of this time. And it's even a bigger part of my life now. But yes, they were always in my mind. And the thing I would say is that's interesting, I think, is that, you know, at times it was frustrating to have to wait. And I would curse, I would say, you know, if I only had money, I could be writing the damn things now, you know. If I won the lottery, I could go and write them now. But I'm so glad I had to wait, because I learned so much about being a woman and being a woman exercising power in a world where men hold all the power cards, because that's what these women were doing in the 15th century. You know, they weren't the sort of repressed victims or that Hollywood would have us believe. They were powerful women in their own right, but they were still within a deeply chauvinistic and a deeply sort of paternalistic society. And they had to manage around the edges of male power all of the time. And let me tell you, nothing much has changed in the 500 years since, because I would often find myself in the boardroom and the only woman in the big room, and trying to get men to do the things I needed them to do or that would be right to do, you know, for the sake of the company or whatever, and thinking to myself, I am exercising and learning all of the skills that these women exercised in the 15th century. And you know, as women, We do it all the time. It's almost instinctive in us how to manage that situation and how to take, how to assume authority when no one is actually giving it to you. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And you learn to manage that. And that was such a valuable lesson to learn, I think, for the writing of these novels. So I'm really glad I didn't write them when I was in my 20s, because I didn't know all of that then.
Well, that's so interesting. And a reminder, I think sometimes we think, oh, all that time ago, all those hundreds of years, things were so different. They really weren't all that different. And I appreciate that. And what I'd like to do is look at some of the specifics, because you've given us a really great sort of overview of these women. And there are women, and it's this very war torn in a way for their lives, very much in the middle of an ongoing battle for power that went on for a long time. So let's just jump in with, let's start with Cecily. And what drew you to her in particular? Cecily Neville, who came from a powerful family and then married into a powerful family. Such a fascinating woman.
Well, she is. She's amazing. And when I was very young and started looking at the women of the Wars of the Roses, she was the one that it was hardest to get a grip of, the hardest one to really find out about. And I couldn't understand why. So I went looking for her in Shakespeare, and I decided that the fault, the reason that Cecily has sort of slipped through history to such an extent, can largely be laid at Shakespeare's door. Because he didn't do her son any favours, Richard III, but he didn't do her any either, because when she appears in the history plays, I mean, she hardly appears at all. And when she does, she's very old, she's very pious, she's very dull. She hasn't got anything much to say. And it doesn't matter because no one's listening to her anyway. And she just wanders around saying how awful her kids are and how it's not her fault, you know. So I think for 500 years, everyone's read Shakespeare and thought, oh, well, that's Cecily Neville. She's boring, isn't she? Oh, look at Elizabeth Woodville. Isn't she sexy? Let's go and have a look at her. So I think she sort of slipped through the net. I mean, there wasn't even an academic biography of her until 8 years ago, 2017. So, and yet, once you get under the skin of her, she's just extraordinary. And the thing I found extraordinary about her, she lived for 80 years. She was the only major protagonist of the Wars of the Roses to survive them from beginning to end. The only one. And to still come out, to survive it. And she, for that 80-year period, was never far from the absolute heart of political and royal power in England. Her mother was half-sister to Henry IV. Her father was one of the first earls to declare for Henry IV when he took the throne from Richard III. So she was brought up in a pro-Lancastrian household, absolutely. And then she became, of course, the matriarch of the House of York. And, she was very much, she worked in close political partnership with her husband, Richard, Duke of York. It's clear that she was his confidant and his counsel, that he relied on her judgment. You get the impression, it wasn't a love match. They were married when they were 8 years old. It was a political marriage made by her parents. But you get a sense of a really strong, heartfelt partnership where they really relied on each other and trusted each other, and they worked together. They were similarly intelligent, similarly ambitious, and they had the same aims in mind. And it was all about the elevation of their family and the management of power. Mm. And then, she was very much behind Edward IV's coming to the throne, her elder son. And, in the very early years of his reign, when he was still very young, he was only 18 when he came to the throne, she was kind of his number one source of counsel and advice. And then it is my conviction that she was very much behind Richard III's push for the throne too, for all sorts of complicated reasons. And, you know, she survived 10 years into, so she built a dynasty, she saw it fall. She survived 10 years into the Tudor dynasty and managed to die in 1495 on reasonably good terms with Henry VII, and with her granddaughter as Queen of England.
Yes.
She's such a survivor, you know.
Yes. And that's one of the things. And I'm so glad you brought up all those points, but it is really interesting. You mentioned she comes from this very Lancastrian household, and yet she and Richard, Duke of York, seem to completely trust each other. In other words, she's not looked at as an outsider. She's not looked at by him as a Lancastrian, at least by the time that this battle between them emerges. Why do you think, or what are your thoughts about how fully a Yorkist she becomes?
She becomes utterly, and for her, she wouldn't have looked at it as Lancaster and York, red rose, white rose. She would have looked at it as my family.
Mm.
And that's interesting. It's interesting if you look at the origins of her marriage to Richard, because Ralph Neville, her father, had 23, 24 children. Two different wives, thankfully. One woman didn't have to do all that. But he had 13 daughters. And what he and Cecily's mother, Joan Beaufort, were brilliant at was making dazzling marriages for their children, marriages that would elevate their family. There's no saying, Neville's always marry up. And the way that Ralph did that, particularly for his daughters, was he would take on the wardship of young noblemen who had been orphaned. And remember, we're at the dog end of the 100 Years' War, so there are lots of guys being killed in France and leaving noble orphans. They would come into his household. They would typically have rich titles in their pockets, and he would marry them to his daughters and therefore bring those wealth and title into his domain. And that's exactly what he did with Cecily. But she was the youngest of 13 daughters, so you can imagine that they might have been casting around a bit by that point. And Richard was a fantastic catch in that he had the earldom of Cambridge in his back pocket. But there was a problem, because his father had been executed for treason in 1415 against Henry V, the father of Henry VI, who was on the throne at the time Cecily and Richard are married. So if he was going to be able to come into his inheritance, he was going to have to win the approval and trust of a Lancastrian king. And Ralph, Cecily's father, who was firmly Lancastrian and a huge supporter of Henry IV, V, and VI, you can imagine him saying to the young Richard, who arrived in his household when he was about 12 years old, look, Richard, here's how it's going to work. You're going to keep your nose clean. You're going to be a good king's man. You're going to serve this Lancastrian king, my chum, and you are going to win his confidence, and you will get your earldom, and you will make my daughter, a noble. And then it got sort of better and sort of worse, because his maternal uncle died childless, which meant he was also heir to the Dukedom of York. Hurrah! But that also made him heir to the Mortimer claim to the throne. So suddenly he wasn't just the son of a traitor, he was the son of a traitor with a claim to the throne that was arguably better than the Henry's, than the Lancastrian claim. But it is evident to me that Richard's intention was to remain loyal to the House of Lancaster and to remain loyal to Henry VI. And I think if Henry VI had been a halfway decent king, Richard, Duke of York, would have served him very happily as one of his, he would have been kind of the wealthiest and most important noble in the land. So he'd have been kind of number two, and he would have been utterly content with that. And I think Cecily would too. that you do hear people that will tell you that Richard, Duke of York, was always aiming for the throne. I don't believe that. I think he was determined to be loyal until the point when it became impossible for him to be loyal. And, at that point, you face this terrible situation where you are either going to take power or the people who have the power are going to destroy you. And that's the hard choice. And that's the choice Richard had to make. Yes. And at that point, Cecily was absolutely at his side making it. And I think probably, in fact, she probably saw the need for it long before he did. Because if you think about it, her father, Ralph Neville, was one of the first nobles to declare for Henry IV when he took the throne from the sort of weak, useless, incompetent Richard II. Yes. So this sort of idea that a good noble, good, strong nobleman has certainly the right and perhaps even the duty to replace a weak, ineffectual king who isn't doing a good job is kind of the what did you do in the War Daddy story that she grew up on, that she was weaned on. So later in life, when she could see that Henry VI was being an utter disaster as a king, and that the country was in turmoil, and our French holdings were being lost, and it was all going to hell in a handbasket, and worse, the coterie around Henry VI were emerging as a direct threat to her and her family. You can imagine her going to Richard and say, look, it's clear what we need to do here, right? We need to do what my dad did, right? You do see that, don't you? And I can imagine Richard going, yeah, I do, but I really don't want to look at it. I don't want to be a traitor because I sort of know how that ends. Look at what happened to my dad.
Right. Well, and they're two fathers. It's much more
complicated. It's psychologically complicated, I think, for the two of them.
Yes, and I do think they're two fathers, and the stories of their two fathers, as you point out, her father ended up being successful. That could have gone the other way. Other nobles could have risen up in support of Richard II. Doesn't seem likely given how bad he was, but they could have. And Bolingbroke, all of that could have gone the other way. And Richard, Duke of York, saw it in his family go the other way. So it is very complicated, and it's not like, and I so appreciate you saying this, because we have this idea of Yorkists always being Yorkists and Lancastrians always being Lancastrians and those roses always being there. And of course, none of that's true at all. But it was a time where Richard, Duke of York, was being shut out of power. And as you say, that's the only option. So here comes Richard and Cecily's decision, and it does seem that she was very active in that, and he certainly relied on her.
Yeah.
So they are fighting together in the way for the throne, and he has, by then, they have had children. There is a household, and in some of the ways that I have looked at Richard III, who is pretty young when all this starts, but he's growing up in this household where when it's not working out well, you take responsibility for making changes. So what do you think that family was like as the decision was made? So Cecily and Richard and their children, as you say, that is her family. Tell us a little bit about that.
So Cecily gives Richard, Duke of York, 12 children. 7 of them survive into adulthood, and the rest die very young. So she has 4 sons and 3 daughters. And by the time things have really reached crucial point with her family's relationship with Henry VI, by the time it's coming to war, that's around the time that Richard III is born. So her family, her older children, are still quite young. I sometimes think at that point when Richard was born, Cecily, when she found out, she must have thought, my God, the last thing I need right now is another pregnancy. Number 12, here we go. Because her family was in it was desperate at that point. So Richard in particular was definitely born in the sort of cauldron of war. Absolutely. So that state of tension between their family and the House of Lancaster, their family and the reign of Henry VI would have been just the common currency of the childhood of all of those children. And of course, at the point where Richard, Duke of York, dies, is killed in battle, he's killed alongside his second son, Edmund, who was 17 years old at the time, in his first military campaign, his first battle, and he is killed. So the cost of conflict was something that family, those siblings, would have been aware of from a very early age, because they saw it played out so clearly. Edward was 17 when was 18 when his father and when Edmund were killed. Richard was about 8 or so. So, it's a brutal, brutal time. And the cost of losing, which was so high,
Yes.
if you lose, you die.
Yes.
You don't just go back down the snake and start again up the ladder. You're dead. So they would have all been aware right from the beginning that the game is played for really, really high stakes.
Really high stakes. And that loss represented because it wasn't just that Richard was killed, he was humiliated. He was, the family was now in real danger, real political danger, mortal danger.
Mortal danger.
So Cecily is trying to protect her sons the best she can. She's got Edward fighting. Do you think there was ever a question of her reaching out to Edward and saying, just come home, give up the fight. How does
that would have been an impossible thing to do, because if you think what had happened in that, it was the Christmas of 1460. So Richard, Duke of York, was killed at Wakefield on the 30th of December 1460, along with Edmund. And at the time, Edward, the older boy, was on the Welsh borders, rallying troops. The plan was that he was then going to meet up with his father, but of course that all fell apart. So let's assume at that point, when Richard and Edmund are dead, Cecily said, just come home, Edward. He'd have been coming home to face an army that would destroy and kill him. There was an army heading for London where Cecily was. So you've got Cecily in London, Edward on the Welsh borders, Cecily's with her children in London, Edward's on the Welsh borders, Richard, Duke of York, is dead, and Marguerite and her army are heading for London.
Right.
And her only hope at that point, it is the absolute lowest ebb for her house, and she is desperate. And her only hope is Edward. He's the only game that she has in play. So she is much more likely to be writing him and saying, get your army together, get a shift on, because I've got a battle on my hands here, keeping Marguerite out of London. And she's so terrified at that point that she puts her 2 youngest sons, Richard and George, on a boat and sends them off to Burgundy on their own, hoping that they'll be okay, hoping that Isabella of Burgundy will take them under her protection. No guarantees. But she was so convinced that they would be in mortal danger if Marguerite entered London. And so there was no, this isn't working, let's give it all up and retire to the countryside. That was never going to happen. You destroy or you are destroyed.
Okay. So thank you, because that's what I want people to understand, is how desperate and literally fight to the death this battle was. And this mother, because we think of her in all kinds of ways. She's a mother who's putting her 2 youngest children on a boat, and hopefully they'll be fine, encouraging her other son to take up that battle that has just robbed her of her son and her husband. So, as you say, low ebb. But what I love about Cecily is she doesn't stop fighting.
No, knock her down and she'll get up and fight again.
Absolutely. And it turns out, and when you look at, I love just sort of thinking of those 2 young boys, they go off to Burgundy. They're not treated incredibly well. They're kept alive. But within a short period of time, the wheel of fortune takes another big spin, and Edward at age 18 is successful. And all of a sudden, those boys are coming back to see their brother crowned. But think of Cecily in a fairly short period of time. She goes from that low ebb to her son's coronation. So
Yeah,
tell us a little bit about that.
it's literally Christmas to Easter. So Duke of York was killed on the 30th of January 1460, and Edward wins at the Battle of Towton in Easter Sunday 1461. So 4 months of absolute. Can you imagine the stress levels? And she's in London. What happens is she writes to Edward after Wakefield and says, "You'd better get to London. Big trouble. Dad's dead. Hurry. Army coming. Panic." He wins a huge battle on the Welsh borders, Battle of Mortimer's Cross, and he comes to London. And he accepts the throne, accepts the crown, but he's got to leave immediately and go north because there's another army he's got to fight. Who does he leave in control of his kingdom while he goes off to fight? His mum.
Mother. Mm-hmm.
And he makes her head of his household, which is effectively his regent. So she is keeping all the plates spinning and all the balls in the air while he's off there fighting. And she doesn't know whether he's coming back or not. And she's kind of running his nascent kingdom. And you can imagine what it's like. There's this sort of hotbed of what is going to happen, and all the European ambassadors like moths around a flame in Westminster to try and find out what's happening and write back to their masters on the continent about it all. And there's a great letter from one of the ambassadors back onto the continent, and I paraphrase, but it basically says, look, here's what's happening in England. It looks like it's regime change, and it looks like Edward's going to be king, and that's great because the people love him like he's a god. But if we want to do business in England, we need to do it with his mother. And that tells you everything you need to know about Cecily.
Yes, yes, I love that. And the recognition, and you've mentioned this is a time where men are in charge, and yet those men realize anything we need to do business with his mother. Yeah. So she has built up a presence and a level of authority and expertise. I mean, she really knows what she's doing in many ways more than her 18-year-old son. For good reasons. He doesn't have the experience. It was supposed to be Richard, not Edward, who takes the throne. It was supposed to be an experienced fighter and noble and everything, but it ends up being Edward. So Edward eventually puts down the rebellions, does not end the Lancastrian claim because it comes back. But for a time, Edward is king, and Cecily is in this position of being the most powerful, I would say, woman at court for sure.
She is. Until the point where Edward marries, she is first lady.
Yes. Yeah. So when he marries Elizabeth Woodville, who was not the person that was being chosen for him. No, and was not necessarily a welcome choice. What is that like then for Cecily?
Well, I think you have this strange period, and this is where I guess in the transition from my first novel to my second, there's a sort of change in mood, because the first novel, it takes us to that point in 1461 where Edward becomes king, and it's very much a story about Cecily. Marguerite of Anjou is in there, but it's very much about Cecily. When you come into the second book, the focus widens a little bit, I would say, to really look at the big four women of the Wars of the Roses. Cecily's still our central character, but we've got Marguerite of Anjou and Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort, and that is really the point of what the second book is about. All four of those women, once Edward is king, Cecily is king's mother.
Yes.
She's got it. But all those other three women in the course of the next few decades will all contest to put their boy on the throne and become king's mother themselves. And
Yes.
they will do it for the sake of survival, or they will do it out of fear, or they will do it out of ambition, all sorts of different things, but they will all do very questionable and perhaps morally dubious things to try and put their boy on the throne. And that really is the question at the heart of the story is it's the book about the Wars of the Roses, yes. But what it really is a book about mothers and what they are prepared to do for their sons. What will you, if your boy is in danger and you think the only safe place for him to be is on the throne, what will you do to put him there? Or what won't you do? And it's a really short list. That what won't you do?
Yes, yes.
Mothers will do terrible things. So that's kind of what the story is about. And as the very minute Edward is on the throne, as far as Cecily is concerned, because as you say, the House of Lancaster has not gone away. In her mind, the clear and present danger is Marguerite of Anjou.
Yes.
She's going to come back. And
yes.
Cecily knows her really well, and she knows how hard Marguerite is going to fight for her son, and she understands that. So she's saying to Edward, you can't afford to sit on your laurels, and you can't afford not to look at Marguerite. Don't think just because she's a woman, she's not a threat. Yeah.
And that is such a good point, because Henry VI himself was not a powerful threat, but he was the way that Marguerite would make sure her son got to the throne and the Lancastrian followers, But it's so interesting because Cecily and Marguerite did have a history. These women knew each other and had been in different relationship opportunities or whatever. They had histories together. They knew each other. It was a tight circle.
Yeah.
But there could not be four boys. At that time, no one was thinking a woman might be on the throne. There could not be four men on the throne. There's only going to be one king. So there's only going to be one king's mother. And those women they know so well are the other alternatives. That is such a fascinating moment.
It is. And that was one of the things that in that long 40-year period of waiting to write these novels hit me like a hammer, because traditional historians, male historians, the patriarchal version of history only deals with women, is only interested in women insofar as they relate to their men. So Cecily is Richard, Duke of York's wife, and Edward IV's mum, and Richard III's mum, and Marguerite of Anjou is Henry VI's wife, blah, blah, blah. But what are they to each other? And it was years. I had been looking at these women for years until it dawned on me, oh my God, they were all really deeply connected to each other. And once I realized that, I thought, well, how could I not know? How could I be so stupid as to not realize that? But it's the way history is told. So Marguerite and Cecily knew each other. Cecily was the first woman Marguerite met when Marguerite came over from France to marry Henry. She met her in Rouen, entertained her there, and put her on the ship and sent her to England. And they were first and second lady really in England during Marguerite's rule. So they knew each other really well. And, Elizabeth Woodville, at that point where Edward confesses that he's married Elizabeth Woodville, Cecily isn't going, who? She's going, Elizabeth Woodville? Jaquetta Bedford's daughter? Because she'd known Elizabeth Woodville's mom. They were both 16. They'd met in France in 1431, and they'd known each other all of that time. And at the time, Edward, Cecily's eldest son, who became king, was born in Rouen when Richard Duke of York was Lord Lieutenant there. And Richard Woodville, who was Jaquetta's husband and Elizabeth Woodville's father, was one of Richard Duke of York's captains in France. So they were in that sort of English enclave in Rouen. And, Elizabeth was 5 years older than Edward. So you can almost imagine a sort of 5-year-old Elizabeth peering over the crib at this newborn child, which would one day be her husband. So they were really, they were deeply connected. And Cecily and Margaret Beaufort were cousins. Margaret was a Beaufort. Cecily's mother was a Beaufort. It's clear to me that those two women were very good friends from about 1460, 61. They were good friends. They liked each other. They respected each other. They spent time together. They shared common interests. They went shopping together. They shopped together. They exchanged books. They were close. And of course, they were, Cecily was a generation older than Margaret. And it's clear to me that Margaret really looked up to Cecily as a role model, as a sort of aristocratic, powerful woman. And she sort of modelled her behaviour on Cecily, I think. And that's really evident when, in the end, Margaret Beaufort's son Henry Tudor becomes king. And Margaret Beaufort very much models her behaviour as king's mother on Cecily's.
Yes.
So that means when those four women each betray each other in the course of their history, and they do, it's not like you're having a pop at a distant enemy, with someone you don't know. You are betraying a friend. You are driving the blade between the ribs of someone you have known a long time and liked, loved maybe even. And there is a psychological and emotional cost involved in doing that. And you don't do it because you hate that woman. You do it because you love that son.
No, and it comes back to what you mentioned earlier. They truly believed that the only place their son would be safe was on the throne.
Mm.
And in some cases, I think they saw one of these other women maybe as a direct threat to their son. And so they had to do what they could to protect their son. So one example of that, and I'm going back to this, you mentioned earlier, is Cecily's role after Edward IV dies. He has two sons, one of whom is proclaimed king, but is not crowned. And then we get Richard III. So talk us through that very complicated, still an ongoing debate about what really happened, the mystery that will never be solved or whatever. But talk us through Cecily's role in that shift in power, because that's York, within the York family. So there are some splinters even within that tightly.
Oh, huge splinters.
Yes.
Yeah. Cecily built a dynasty and the kids mess it up. Basically. So to understand what happened in 1483, and that summer when Richard took power, we have to go back a bit. And it all goes back to Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. And whether or not, Edward IV married Elizabeth Woodville in secret. As you said, she was definitely not the woman he should have married. There were ongoing negotiations at the time for him to marry a French princess, Bona of Savoy, which would have brought him, a posh man with France. It would have brought him a big dowry, which his treasury desperately needed, a political alliance. It would have been great. And the Earl of Warwick, his cousin, has been off in France negotiating this marriage, and he comes back and says, Edward, it's done deal. All you've got to do is sign here, boy. Bona of Savoy. And I said, I'm terribly sorry. I think I'd better tell you at this point that I've actually married Elizabeth Woodville. Oops, forgot to tell you.
Yes, and let those negotiations go on. He let those negotiations go on.
Yeah, just bizarre behavior. But, remember, he's super young. And he's also, think of the male adolescent ego. He's 18 years old. He's 6'4". He's, women faint at the sight of him. He's won every battle he's been pitched into. He's king of England, for goodness sake, against all expectations. Who's going to tell him what he can and can't do? He thinks nobody's going to tell him what he can and can't do. So if he wants to marry Elizabeth Woodville, he's going to do it, right? It'll all sort itself out. He'll push his way through. Then the question arises, he's done that once. Is it possible he did it twice? And the whole point, the whole crux on which Richard's assumption of the throne turns is whether or not, before he married Elizabeth Woodville, Edward made a secret marriage with Eleanor Talbot. And there was clearly evidence in 1483 that now no longer exists, presumably destroyed by Henry VII, that he did. Now, historians, pro-Ricardian historians, have turned themselves inside out and backwards to try and work out who would have known about that secret marriage. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, well, Eleanor Talbot's sister, Elizabeth, was married to Cecily's nephew, John Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. John Mowbray's mum is Cecily's sister. So she's going to know. So don't you think at some point, Cecily's sister is going to come to Cecily and say, do you know what's going on with your boy Edward and Eleanor? The women are going to talk, right? The women are going to know. Eleanor's going to tell her sister, who's going to tell her husband, who's going to tell her his mother, who's going to tell Cecily. Now, back in 1463, 64, when all of this is happening, it's going to, if Cecily found out about it, it's going to be in her best interests to sweep it under the carpet, make the problem go away. In 1483, when you've got the kingdom in turmoil, the Woodvilles being absolutely antagonistic to her family, distrustful of her family, mounting a rebellion against Richard III, potentially attempting his assassination. The French at the door threatening to invade a very young son of Edward IV looking to be king. Richard's life in danger. She's suddenly, it's going to be in her interests to reveal it. So to my mind, and I can't prove any of this, but it kind of holds water. Cecily at this point is going to be saying to Edward, look, son, why don't you have a chat with the Bishop of Bath and Wells, William Hastings? Sorry, not William Hastings, Robert Stillington, the guy who married. Yeah. And that's how it's all going to come out. So at that point, Cecily has got a really difficult decision to make. And it's, do we let Edward's young son come to the throne, although he is potentially a bastard, when the Woodville faction is threatening the remainder of my family, threatening Richard's life, certainly. Do I let that happen? Or do I use good cause and legally watertight argument to displace those two boys and put a man on the throne, a proven leader and a proven military man, a proven fighter and administrator on the throne, my son Richard III, who can, has the military prowess and the political clout to confront the threatened invasion by the French and to deal with the Woodville faction. Well, here's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to do. Surely that's what I'm going to do. And then the whole question arises, well, did Richard III kill the princes in the Tower? And if he did Cecily know about that? Was she upset about that? Did she support that? Was she an accessory after the fact? And, there is no solid evidence that those children were murdered by Richard III or by anybody else. And a growing body of evidence that suggests that they survived well beyond 1485. And what we do know about that fateful summer in 1483, when, in short order, Edward IV dies, his son is proclaimed king, Richard becomes protector. Within a matter of weeks, those boys kind of disappear, and suddenly Richard's sitting on the throne being king. What happens? And we do know that for that period, Richard was operating out of, using as his sort of headquarters, Cecily's townhouse in London, Bernard's Castle. So he's deep in her counsel and she's deep in his. Can't see how that can't be. Is she going to be saying to him, look, here's what you've got to do, you've got to kill the kids? I don't think so. But the interesting thing is, and I don't know if you know about this, but she was very aware of a situation that was very similar to this, and it was part of her family history. So at that point, when Henry IV became king, remember, and her father was deeply involved in all of that, Henry IV was not the only candidate to replace Richard II. There was the Mortimer family, who had a strong claim to the throne. But at that time when Henry IV returned to England from his exile and mounted his campaign, the Mortimer heirs were two young boys, very similar in age, really, to the princes in the Tower. And no one was going to fight. No one was going to say, look, we'll have one of them when you've got great, big, marvellous Henry IV sitting there. So they were sort of put to one side. So what does Henry IV... But it was recognised throughout the country that they had a better claim. So what does Henry do? So you might say, well, it's a clear situation. They're rivals to his throne. He's going to kill them, right? But he doesn't. He takes them into custody. He keeps them in kind of close custody, and kind of begins a re-education process, really, to assimilate them into his court and make them amenable to give them a life in which they can succeed. One of those boys dies of natural causes anyway when he's quite young. The other one, Edmund Mortimer, goes on to serve Henry IV for the rest of his life, loyal, faithful, eventually dies in Ireland in his service, in Henry's service. To the point where when there is an attempt to launch a rebellion in his name in 1415, he goes to Henry and says, look, I just want you to know this is going on and it's got nothing to do with me. I'm not involved. Now, Cecily knew this story because the guy who then was executed for that attempt to put Edmund Mortimer on the throne was the father of Richard, Duke of York. It was the Northampton plot in 1415. So that she knows that story really, really well. So she's not saying to Richard, we've got to kill the kids. She's saying, we've got to do exactly what Henry did with the Mortimer boys. We've got to take them out of London, out of this hotbed of political discontent and turmoil. Begin this process of re-education, assimilate them into the court, but we must not make the mistake Henry did. We've got to keep their whereabouts secret. We don't have to kill them. What would we want to kill them for? Suddenly, when you put the women back at the center of the story and think about what the women knew, it all starts making a lot more sense, doesn't it?
Okay. So she saw a similar experience where Mortimer actually did remain loyal, even when offered a little treasonous plot.
Yes.
So the possibility of that could hold for her.
Yeah.
Okay.
It would always be a risk. It's always a risk if you've got two guys floating around who could attract, it's always a risk, but wouldn't that be a risk that Cecily would be prepared to take?
So why is that to send them out when they have George's son in the Tower? So we haven't really talked about George, Duke of Clarence in this story, but she did have another son.
The difficult middle boy.
The middle child. Yes. So, and he is caught up. We know he betrays his brother at least once because he fights for the Lancastrians when Edward, because Henry VI wasn't killed, he and Marguerite bring them back, and there is a force brought against Edward, and he and Richard have to flee and then fight again for the crown. So George changed sides and then comes back on side, but it's not clear at the end. He seems to have betrayed his brother again, and he is killed in the tower. The rumor is, or tradition, that he's drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, right?
Yeah.
But his son also could be a claimant to the throne.
Yeah.
So do you think that ever was raised by Cecily, or was his youth again an inexperience and the taint of treason from his father? Does that sort of disqualify him?
It kind of does disqualify him in a way. So he's legally attainted because his father was attainted when he was executed for treason. So he's in this kind of political no man's land in a way. But on the other hand, put yourself in Richard. Let's assume for a moment that Richard III was a child murdering tyrant. He would have killed Edward's sons, but for sure he would have killed George's. If he was clearing every obstacle that stood between him and the throne, he would have killed George's son, because attainters can be overturned, right?
Right.
And he still had the royal blood of Edward IV from a brother, his father George, who was older than Richard III and therefore a better claim. So for sure, yeah, Richard would have been an idiot to leave him alive, but he didn't.
Right. Right.
So if he was a child murdering tyrant and an assassin, he was a pretty sloppy one.
Well, he does leave George there. Right? I mean, George's son there.
He
all
leaves
right.
George's son there. Yeah.
And actually, that young man lives into the reign of Henry VII. So let's get a little bit further down the path here. So now Richard's on the throne, and is Cecily again in that king's mother as close as she was to Edward at the beginning of Edward's reign? Is she involved in Richard's reign?
She is, but I think it's very different because, Edward, when he came to the throne, was an 18-year-old boy. Richard, when he comes to the throne, is a mature man of experience and a political operator. Edward IV, when he came to the throne, was a single man. Richard III, when he comes to the throne, is a married man of some years standing with Anne Neville. So there wasn't that need for Cecily to be quite so involved. And remember, by this time, she's significantly older too. So they remain very close, but there isn't that sort of hand-in-gloveness that you get with Edward. But I do think it's telling that that her relationship with... I do think it's telling that in the immediately before Bosworth, before he goes off to fight Henry VII, Henry Tudor, he goes and visits his mum and spends several days with her at her place in Berkhamsted, her castle in Berkhamsted. And, I'm sure we're chatting things over.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't think it was that, that Richard would have been so reliant on her in the way that Edward was in the early years, because it's just a different scenario. And you get all the time I was studying these guys, my sense was, and I know mothers are not meant to have favourites, but it's my observation that they often do, whether they admit it to themselves or not. And I think for Cecily, Edward was the golden boy for whom she would do, I mean, sometimes I think he was just so hot she could barely touch him, And what's not to like? He saved them at that crucial time. He was glorious and gold and beautiful, and all of that. And I think Richard was the youngest child, the somewhat come lately child, the child that was born at a terrible time of conflict. He grew up absolutely in the shadow of war, and he grew up in the shadow of much older, more glamorous brothers. And you can almost imagine Cecily saying, "Oh, meet my children. Here's Edward, isn't he gorgeous?" And he's Edmund, my lovely second son, and George, who's very handsome, but let's not dwell. And then here are my lovely girls, aren't they gorgeous? And then there's Richard. That's the one. A bit like my mum, I was the youngest of four, and my mum would always call me Richard John Mark Ann before you got she had to go through and wrote to remember who I was. And you can imagine being a little bit like that with Cecily. He's the youngest child. But you do get a sense of a respectful relationship between them, a loving relationship between them. But it's just a different scenario because of the respective ages when they become king. Yeah.
Okay. And that's interesting because eventually Richard does face this huge challenge to the throne by the son of another mother. So we bring in now Margaret Beaufort, who again has been part of this story all along, at the heart of the court during the whole time of the Wars of the Roses, knew all these people really well. And it's interesting to me that both Margaret and Marguerite of Anjou, they each have one child, their son, and everything goes there. Where Cecily has to do a lot for more than one child, Margaret Beaufort, Marguerite of Anjou is just the one. So Margaret Beaufort may have, and I'd like to hear what you think of this, collaborated or been in contact with Elizabeth Woodville about the possibility of Elizabeth of York and Henry Tudor, before he becomes Henry VII, being together and taking the throne from Richard III. So do you see a collaboration there? Would Cecily have been suspect of these two women, do you think, or was she sort of removed from that by then? So talk us through that a little bit.
My feeling about that is that at that stage, Cecily would have been deeply suspicious of Elizabeth Woodville because she knew, by that stage, Elizabeth had already attempted to kill Richard III and had already made it clear that she was in high dudgeon against the House of York. Cecily's family, her remaining family, and she was in sanctuary in Westminster. So certainly Cecily would have been suspicious of her. My strong feeling is that Margaret Beaufort was the knife in the dark that Cecily didn't see coming.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. And because they were close, because they were good friends, and then as a result, what that must have cost. And it depends. See, I'll go back a bit and explain because Cecily, Margaret's relationship with her son is so particular, and the way that she has to support him is so particular. I mean, as you said, she has this single chick in her nest, and my God, he was hard bought. Because Margaret was orphaned when she was about 9 months old, very, very small child, and she was left as a very eligible heiress on the marriage market. And when she was 12, Henry VI married her to his half-brother Edmund Tudor, and it was really a way of giving Edmund land and titles and money and without Henry having to spend any money. And that's not unusual. Girls were often married at that age. Edmund was in his late 20s by then, I think I'm right in saying. Edmund Tudor. And usually those marriages wouldn't be consummated till the girl was 16 or so, when she was sexually mature. But there was a problem with the way the marriage contract was written in Margaret's case, which meant that if she died without having a child, if there was no issue from that marriage when she died, all of that land and titles and so on wouldn't go to Edmund, it would revert back to the crown. So Edmund had a very strong motive and an overwhelming desire to make sure that there was issue of that marriage as soon as possible. So when she was 12 years old and he'd just married her, he took her to bed and he got her pregnant. And she gave birth to Henry Tudor when she was barely 13. And by that time, she was already a widow because Edmund had contrived to die in the meantime. So his plans worked out really well. So at 13, she has this boy. She's a widow. And what we do know about Margaret Beaufort was she was tiny. So can you imagine, giving birth at 13? And we do know that Margaret married twice after that. She never had any other children. And the idea is perhaps that she couldn't because of the trauma of that first birth. But she is utterly devoted to Henry. And, the letters between them, she refers to him as her beloved son, her one desired joy in all the world. And yet they spend very little time apart. And from the time when he's quite young, he becomes, for various reasons, an exile in France, and they are separated. And she spends years trying to find a way to bring him back to England and restore him to the earldom of Richmond, to which he is then kind of entitled.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of people who will say to you that Margaret was always plotting to bring Henry VII back and make him king. Well, that's nonsense. That would have been an impossible leap to make. I think for the whole of Edward IV's reign, if she could have found a way to bring her son back as Earl of Richmond, a loyal servant to the Yorkist King Edward IV, she'd have said, great, that's what I'm aiming for. And she worked very hard with Cecily, and she worked very hard with Edward IV to try and make that happen. And the tragedy of it is that on the eve of Edward's death, she was on the cusp of it. An agreement had been reached with Brittany for Henry to come home. Edward had conceded that he would have his titles. She had carved out land holdings for him from his own estate. The day was almost set for his return. Edward dies. Everything goes into chaos. The alliance with Brittany and so on and so forth collapses, and suddenly Henry's not coming home. The devastating disappointment of that, 12, 14 years of trying to bring that boy home, thinking you've done it, and then, God, it's gone again. And then I think that just in the chaos of Richard III's reign, she saw an opportunity and suddenly thought, shit, I could do this. And I could bring him back as king. And she saw that opportunity and she took it. And that was the last thing Cecily expected.
Okay. And you mentioned
she should have seen it coming, and she didn't.
Because you mentioned she had been trying to help bring Henry back during the reign of Edward IV, which would have satisfied everybody had Edward IV then lived on.
Yeah.
Okay. So now she has stake in the game. Elizabeth Woodville, who's in sanctuary, has a daughter who could marry Henry. So she's not going to be the king's mother, but she could be the queen consort's mother.
Yeah.
Do you think Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort conspired together, worked together, were in contact?
Yeah, I think Margaret Beaufort threw Elizabeth a bone.
Okay.
And said, look, I think Margaret, and this is hard evidence of events in that 1483-85 period, really hard to find, but my instincts tell me what went on there. We know that they were exchanging letters, Elizabeth and Margaret, when Elizabeth was in sanctuary. And I think Margaret is looking at it and thinking, my boy Henry's claim to the throne is weak to the point of being ridiculous. But if I marry him to Elizabeth of York, then he becomes so much more, dependable. If I can convince England that Richard III has killed the princes in the Tower. So, it's clear to me that those rumors, that speculation of where those boys are, is coming from somewhere.
Okay. And it doesn't start immediately, or do you think Margaret starts it immediately?
What these women are absolute masters of propaganda and message and spinning. That's what they all are. That's what they're good at. That's what those women
That's true.
For the sake of their families. So I think Margaret was playing all sorts of cards with that. And she was saying, and there's Elizabeth sitting in sanctuary going, what the hell do I do now? How can I ever come out of this situation? And Margaret saying, we can make all your problems go away. And we can put your daughter on.
Mm-hmm.
So I think at that point, when Elizabeth is in sanctuary and she's very much on her own and cut off, she's very vulnerable and she's very susceptible to suggestions. So I think that happens. Ultimately, do I think that Elizabeth believed that Richard III killed her sons? I don't think she did in the end.
Okay. Do you think she believed they were dead?
Well, that's really debatable. But the one thing that really makes me wonder about that is that, and if we spin forward to after the marriage between Elizabeth and Henry VII, when Elizabeth Woodville is Queen's mother and should have been in a really prime position, in fairly short order, she is stripped of her land and titles and money and wealth, and she ends her life in Bermondsey Abbey in isolation. And her deciding to go to or being sent to Bermondsey happens to coincide with the Lambert Simnel affair. And at the same time, Cecily, Elizabeth Woodville's older son, her grey son, is briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London. And it just looks to me, and I can't prove it, but it just looks to me like they might have been in some way implicated in the Lambert Simnel affair.
Okay.
So maybe at that point, Elizabeth Woodville believed, thought, suspected, hoped that Lambert Simnel was exactly who he said he was and was one of her sons. So that's the awful thing is that I think Elizabeth Woodville probably went to her grave never knowing.
Well, I think that's really true. So here's this woman who, of course, would have hoped. I mean, there was no evidence, there were no bodies. As a mother, you would hope and then not know. So that's really interesting.
And it's also, imagine your dilemma because, you know, Henry and Elizabeth are married. Elizabeth is Queen of England, Queen Consort. Along the way, she's got a few kids.
Right.
And there's these two boys out there somewhere, your sons.
Yeah.
Who might at some point launch an invasion and take all of that away from your daughter Elizabeth.
Right.
Where does that put your head?
Yes. As you said, these mothers who, and you said a long list of what they would do to keep their children safe, a short list of what they would not do. How do you figure that out when you have children,
More than
in
one.
that case, pitted against each other? Yes.
And the same thing happened to Cecily.
Right.
In this case of two children pitted against each other with George and Edward. You know, I often say to people that George is to Edward what Harry is to William today. You know, Prince Harry. He's the number two and he can't bear it. He just doesn't know what to do with himself. He hates being number two. He's jealous. He's emotionally pissed off about it. And he just can't cope with it. He just doesn't know what to do. And, you know, Harry has sort of given his family a load of trouble by dragging their names through the mud in the national papers and all the rest of it. Well, George went a step further than that. He tried to kill him. Right. You know, and what do you do as a what do you do as a mother when you've got one child who seems hell-bent on the destruction of the other? Hell-bent. And brings an army against him, attempts to kill him, not once, not twice, repeatedly. How do you keep loving that? Can you keep loving that child?
Right.
You know, or does that love die? Or does it just become ever more painful? There's a point in this book where Cecily says, I don't know what to pray for. Because she's got two sons, you know, so she's got her three sons in battle.
Yes.
against
against each other.
how can I pray for any outcome because one of them is gonna cop it. One of them's
At least one of them's going down, right? If they're all three in this.
imagine the agony. And I think it's funny, isn't it, the way things repeat? I think Elizabeth must have felt that intensely at the point where she has Elizabeth successfully on the throne of England with Henry Tudor, and she doesn't know where those boys are.
Yes. Well, and that is really, how do you navigate that kind of thing? As a mother who has done so much, sacrificed so much for those children in various ways. And now, so from the titles, first we have Cecily and then the king's mother, singular, because just like there can only be one king, there can only be one king's mother. So we have Margaret Beaufort sort of taking the final step into that role and lives through the reign of her son, Henry VII, into the reign of Henry VIII. So tell us a little bit about, so we have Cecily and Margaret, we have Elizabeth Woodville still alive, Marguerite's gone, but as Henry VII is on the throne, you do still have these three women who are the survivors who are still there. So tell us, is there any interaction? Do we see anything between them once Henry Tudor takes the throne as Henry VII?
I don't see much contact between Cecily and Elizabeth at all, but there's definitely contact between Cecily and Margaret. And, you know, they're back in relation again, aren't they? You know, Margaret's the king's mum and she's the queen's mum. They've got to get along somehow. Well, grandmum. They've got to get along somehow or other, and they kind of do. Cecily rarely comes to court. She keeps her distance. She spends much of her time in East Anglia, largely at Berkhamsted, but travelling around. And she's getting much older then. She's 70 when Bosworth is fought, so she's not as politically active. But we know that they were corresponded, they did business together, they shared servants. She corresponded with Henry Tudor too. She left Margaret gifts in her will. It's one of the most interesting documents, if you ever get the chance to look at it. Cecily Neville's will survives. And I think I'm right in saying that it's the most extensive will of a medieval noble woman that we have. And it's fascinating to see who she's leaving things to at the end of her life, so who she's influencing, you know. She leaves Margaret some very beautiful gifts of books and things like that. And she leaves a cash gift to Henry, sort of a rich gift, but impersonal, much more personal bequests to Margaret. So, yeah, they're kind of rubbing along. And it's interesting, you know, Margaret, Bishop Fisher, who is her chaplain, writes a sort of biography of Margaret. And he describes how after Henry VII comes to the throne, Margaret becomes quite obsessive in her religious observance in a way that she hadn't been previously. She'd always been quite a pious woman in the way that women were then. It was a very pious time. But she became excessively so after he came to the throne and, you know, would fast to extremity and wear a hair shirt and beat herself and spend hours on her knees, even in her later life when she had very bad arthritis and that was painful and hard. She would do it. And it's a great phrase that even at times of great joy and celebration, would weep. And I found myself thinking so much, you know, why? And I just think that betrayal of Cecily, her good friend, in the end, that betrayal was so brutal. And I think it cost her dearly. She didn't do it heartlessly, and she didn't do it without cost. How do you live with that, you know?
That's really interesting because Margaret tends to have a reputation of being so ruthless and almost heartless. and you don't think about what things cost her along the way
Yeah.
and the various disappointments, all the ways she tried to get her son home and safe. She wasn't always trying to put him on the throne. She was just trying to get him home and safe for
Yeah.
so long. So it's just an interesting way to think about Margaret.
It's much more human, isn't it? I think the thing is, with the Wars of the Roses, I think than any period in history almost, we tend to simplify people's characters. There's heartless, ruthless, constantly plotting Margaret Beaufort. There's Richard the child murdering tyrant. Everyone's, Edward the philanderer. Everyone's sort of one dimensional.
Yes.
People aren't like that. People are really complex. People are really, really complicated and complex. And it must have cost Margaret Beaufort. It must have cost her. No one could do that and sleep easily if they had any kind of moral conscience. And I can't help but think, at the end, Cecily would have looked at Margaret and thought, I bloody hate you for doing that. I'll never forgive you. But in your shoes, I'd have done exactly the same.
Well, and it really was to that point for these women that, these are the highest stakes. And there was a time at which for Margaret, there was only one option, just like there had been only one option for Cecily at different times and only one option for Marguerite and Elizabeth Woodville. I mean, they are pushed to exert their power. Yeah. In the way that they can. And I love the books because it takes us into the way these women did have power and did exert their power and did change things.
Yes. Yes.
And I love that because we hear so much about the battles as if the battles is all that was going on. And the battles didn't do everything. These women really did. So
if you think of Margaret Beaufort, and Henry, did Henry beat Richard III on the Battle of Bosworth? Yes. He was the big guy they were the big guys with the swords doing all of that. Yes. Or did Margaret defeat Cecily?
Yeah.
And because it was Margaret, Henry would never have got back to England without Margaret.
Yep.
She planned it, she paid for it, she took all the risks, she put it in place, she did all the negotiating. She brought him to England and put him in a position where he could win the throne of England. Once he's on the battlefield,
Well, but it's the Stanley's troops.
That's the coin toss, isn't it?
But the Stanleys, her family that she married into, swept in to help Henry win. So even in the battle, Margaret is seen because the Stanleys who stay on the sidelines, but suddenly come in and fight for Henry. So you could even say that's part of Margaret.
It's absolutely part of Margaret. It's absolutely part of Margaret.
Yes. And I'm sure Cecily, too, in that few days before he goes to Bosworth, would have been encouraging Richard and, you can do this kind of thing. So they are still, like you say, it's a battle between the two of them in some ways just as much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh.
Margaret Beaufort isn't the mother of the Tudor dynasty because she gave birth to Henry VII. She's the mother of the Tudor dynasty because she put him on the throne.
Right. Yeah.
Simple as that.
Absolutely. I agree that without her, not a chance.
Not a chance. Not a hope in hell. No one at that point was on Team Henry.
No. And he'd been gone for so long. It was all her contacts who supported him. So,
and I think during the time when Edward was alive and Margaret was trying to bring him back, and Cecily supported that, I think she was doing it for two reasons. She would have liked to see her friend get what she wanted, but she would have been aware that Henry was like the last shred, the last tiny remnant of Lancastrian blood. And it would be better to have him under your eye than out of it. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Yes.
So she would have been helping to get him back in England, because that's where she would have wanted him.
Right. Right.
For Margaret's sake, but for political reasons too.
Yes. Strategically, that would be better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Than him wandering around the continent all disaffected
and potentially getting some continental. He didn't, but potentially, I mean, he hired some mercenaries, but so in any case,
he was always a tool that the French could use.
Right. And there was always bad blood with the French. So,
French.
Yes, right. Well, thank you. I could talk to you forever, but I know you have other things. Thank you so much for coming on and taking us sort of behind the curtain into the lives of these women through these books and really bringing Cecily to life, as well as the others. But I think Cecily really has been overlooked, like you said, for so many years, and yet was again the mover, the power behind these men who were fighting in battle. But she really was.
She's a barnstormer, isn't she?
Yes, she's amazing. And the fact that she coordinates all this, pushes for all this, and then outlives so many people to be there at the end.
Last woman standing.
Yes. And that is
Margaret Beaufort outlives her. She actually dies on Margaret Beaufort's birthday.
Isn't that's really interesting too.
Happy birthday, Margaret.
Yes. One final gift.
One final gift. I'm popping off now. Had it.
Well, so you can't forget me ever, even on your birthday.
Yeah.
Well, that is wonderful. And I so appreciate your coming. Now I have to ask, are you working on anything else now?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Can you tell us?
A lot of terror in her voice. Yes. It's a funny one because, in many ways, all of those years waiting to write, I wasn't like thinking, when I'm 55, I'm going to become a novelist. I was thinking, when I'm 55, I'm going to write this story. So when I was getting to the end of the second book, I was thinking, what next? Is that it? Am I done? Do I go and do something else now? And I genuinely didn't know. I wasn't sure. And then I was having lunch with my editor one day, and she said, so have you got an idea for a third book? And I found myself saying, well, there's this Isabella woman who's quite interesting. So tell me about Isabella. And Isabella, of course, is the wife of Edward II. And Edward II is the first English king to be deposed. And it was his wife that did it.
Yes.
So on hearing that, my editor said, we'll sign up for that right now.
Oh, wonderful.
All right, then. So I suddenly found, so that's what I'm working on now. I'm working on Isabella.
Oh, that's wonderful.
But it's a huge challenge because, I haven't been living with Isabella for 40 years the way I have with these ladies.
Yes.
So it's a huge task and it's slightly scary. No, it's not slightly scary. It's very scary. But
well, she too is quite a force. And in my research into that area, in any ways, I've looked through some of these queens, and she's the first one I found referred to as the she-wolf of France. It's something used again, but she was the first one that I found.
Your original she-wolf.
Yes. There's just something fabulous about that in some ways.
I know. And she's another woman who has, had a raw deal from history. Again, to simplify, she's either the terrible, terrible she-wolf who just does a thing and betrays her husband and is an adulteress and a whore and all the rest of it. Or she's a sort of romantic, silly, willy little thing who just can't help herself because she's in love with Roger Mortimer.
Right.
Neither of those things are true.
No.
There's a much more complicated business going on. So that's absolutely fascinating.
Oh, that is wonderful. And she's another mother who fights for her son. So this is something well, we will all look forward to that. Thank you so much for sharing that.
It won't be soon.
All right. Well, that's hopefully it won't take you another 40 years, but we will be patient as we wait. But I can't wait. Well, thank you, Annie, so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time, and I love these books, and I just love talking to you and getting to know these women even better.
Oh, it's been good. And I should say just for one very practical thing, because I know a lot of your audience are in the US, and these books are not yet published in the US. So if you have trouble getting hold of them, my best advice is to buy them online from blackwells.co.uk because they will ship to the US free.
Yes, this is something I suggest frequently because many of us in the US simply, like me, my shelf is full of Blackwell books because I cannot wait for US publication dates. So I will include that link in the show notes so that you too can get your hands on these. So thank you. Thank you again. And that's a great practical, and I will include that as well as information on the books and all of that. So thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'm sure you enjoyed this as much as I did. So thank you for being part of this journey to the past with Royals, Rebels, Romantics, and with Annie. And we will continue together as we see how history shows us what's possible. Thank you for joining us for this summer special in July 2025 on Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I hope you're having a great summer. We'll have some more summer specials coming before we kick off season 6 in September. Have a great summer.